This will be an introduction to animating things with CSS. So to get started, let's talk about animation. So I'm using Sketch here, but I just want to illustrate some of the basic concepts of animation. So imagine you had an object on the screen and it was a red box and you wanted to move it from one side of the screen to the other. What we would do is we would envision where the starting point was and where the ending point was, and we would call these keyframes. You can think of them as the extremes of motion, or significant points along the route of animation. Okay, so here you can imagine I have a box maybe at 0 on the ruler where this red line is. That's the left of 0 in our CSS code, right? And then over here I want the box to move so its left edge is 500 pixels to the left, or well, to the right. Okay, so these would be the two keyframes. So they'd be the extremes of motion. So my box is going to move from here to over here, right? So what do we need to do? Well, we need to come up with the in-betweens. So in-betweens are the steps, or where the computer's going to draw the box along its path, getting from one keyframe to another. Okay? How many in-betweens you have depends on how long the animation is. So when you set the starting and the ending point, or you define the keyframes, you also set a duration for the animation. And the animation, depending on how often the computer redraws the screen and how long the animation is, that'll determine how many in-betweens you get. And it's a little hard to calculate that, but let's imagine that in our example here, we needed to calculate 5 in-betweens, right? So I have 4 here, and then there's 1 on the end, right? I guess maybe 4 in-betweens, right? So let's imagine we did that, right? We might have the left of 0 and then the left of 500, and now we need the 4 in-between steps, okay? So along the way, the computer might generate these in-between values as 100, 200, 300, and 400 pixels, okay? And our box might do this, right? But of course, we would just see it here, and then here, and then here, and that would give the illusion of motion, okay? You could apply the same idea to something like opacity. So for example, if you had your box and it started at 0 or 1 opacity, and you wanted a keyframe of 0 opacity, and you ended up with 5 steps due to the length of time the animation took, then the steps along the way might be 0.8, 0.6, 0.4, 0.2. Okay, so this is the general concept. Anything that has a numeric value in CSS can be animated, right? And what you would be doing is you'd be setting the extremes of animation, right? The extremes of the values, and then the computer will calculate the in-between values. Okay, so let's give that a try with some CSS. I'm going to open up. I'm going to actually make a new folder, I think, on my desktop here. I'll call it animation, and I'm going to open this up in VS Code. And what I think I'll do is I'll make a new file, and I'll save it into my project folder and call it index.html. Okay, and then I'll give myself a couple things to work with. So I've got a div here, and maybe I'll give it a class name, and I'll call it box. Actually, let's just call it box1. We might make a few more of these, right? And for this example, I'm going to do all of my code inside of the style tag so I can see it next to the HTML markup, right? And let's call this like box number 1. And I'm going to give it a width of 100 pixels, a height of 100 pixels, and a background color of red. How about that? And what I want to do is I want to create an animation here. So for this animation, what I think I'll do is I'll animate the rotation. Okay, so I'm going to give my box a starting rotation value. So I'll use the transform property and rotate. And I'll give it a starting value of 0. You can say 0 degrees, but 0 degrees is the same as 0 radians or any of the other measurements, right? So we can just say 0. And to trigger the animation, I'm going to use the hover property, right? So I'll say box1 : hover, no space here, right? Okay, and that means like when the cursor's over the box, I'm going to change the value here to another value. So let's say what I want to do is I want to transform and set a new value, let's say 45 degrees. Okay, and maybe I'll open this up in my browser here. So I've got my file here. I'll open this up in Safari, right? And you can see when I hover over the box, it rotates 45 degrees. Now there's no motion there because it's happening immediately, right? So there's no in-betweens. So what I need to do is I need to tell the computer to generate some in-between states and tell it how long, and in order for the computer to know how many in-between states to make, I also need to tell it the duration, okay? So what we'll do is, let me rearrange my windows here a little bit, right? Maybe I'll put this one over on this side. I'll close up this guy. Okay, so what I'm going to do is on the box here, I'm going to set transition, and the transition property takes a time value, and you can set that in seconds. 1s is 1 second, or you can do milliseconds. So 1,000 ms is 1 second. So 1,000 milliseconds are each millisecond is 1,000th of a second, right? So maybe I'll do this as 400 milliseconds. Now with the transition property, the computer knows how long changes to these properties will take. So if I refresh my page here and then hover, you can see the box takes 400 milliseconds to go from 0 degrees to 45 degrees. Now the transition reverses when I move the cursor off, because the value here on the hover is removed, and then we revert to the 0 degrees, and then the computer says, well, you were at 45 degrees, let's animate back to 0 in 400 milliseconds. Okay, so that gets us started with animation, and you can animate any property with this. So any changes to properties are applied here. So for example, if I like a different color here, I could say background color is maybe we'll change it to blue violet, right? So now when I refresh and I hover, you can see the color changes from red to blue violet, right? And you can animate any property here. Some properties don't animate as well, right? Because they just, you can't in between them, and so they need to step from one value to the next. Other properties, anything that's numeric, right? And colors are actually numeric as far as the computer's concerned, but any numeric properties will transition smoothly from one to the next, okay? So anyway, so that's our first introduction to animation, and then I'll continue this in the next video. Thanks for watching.